A Black Friday chegou no curso English for Life. Do dia 1º de novembro de 2025 ao dia 30 de novembro de 2025, você garante 30% de desconto no nosso curso completo de inglês. São mais de 1.400 aulas, desde o nível básico ao avançado. Tem áudios, exercícios, muito material para você praticar. Temos aulas em português comigo e aulas 100% em inglês com professores nativos. E o melhor de tudo, o acesso é vitalício. Se você acompanha o canal Inglês em alguns minutos, já sabe que o nosso método é 100% prático e direto ao ponto. Bem, para garantir esse super desconto, basta utilizar o cupom BF30 na hora da compra. Então é isso, eu espero que você aproveite essa oportunidade. É a sua chance de aprender inglês por um precinho maravilhoso. Bye bye!
Professor Beard, what's the secret to getting people interested in the Romans, in ancient history?
Well, you have to go about it the right way, really. And I think that perhaps starting from rather arcane and difficult bits of literature isn't the right way. But one thing that you see in Britain is one thing that we know is that an awful lot of our culture and our geography and our place names and so on are actually formed by the Romans. You ask somebody, why do you think so many English place names end in Chester or Caster? Manchester, Doncaster. And they'll often say, I don't know. And then you say, that's because that bit Caster is from the Latin for military camp. And every place that ends Caster or Chester once had a Roman fort on it. And I've got a pretty 99% success record with getting people interested after that. Because suddenly it is a question not of these remote people who wrote some literature that you probably suspect would be boring. It's the people who formed the geography of our country and much of Europe. Why is London the capital of Britain? It's because the Romans made it so.
What do you think we can learn from Roman history?
In political terms, many of the issues and questions and dilemmas that we face now were faced by the Romans, and in many ways we're still thinking about and using their answers. One classic example of that is a famous incident in Roman history in 63 BC, where there's a terrorist plot in the city of Rome to assassinate the political leaders, to torch the city, and to take over. A revolution. And that plot is discovered by one of the most famous Romans of all, Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and wit of Roman culture. And he discovers the plot, he lays it before the Senate, he then decides to execute the leading conspirators without trial, summary execution. And a couple of years later, he's exiled. Now, in many ways, that's the kind of problem we're still facing with modern responses to terrorism. How far should homeland security be more important than civil rights? What about those people in Guantanamo Bay without trial? Where does the boundary come between the safety of the state and the liberty of the citizen? Now, the Romans were debating that in the 60s BC, and in many ways we're debating it along the same terms, and in part we've learnt from how they debated those rights and wrongs.
If you could go back in time, is there one particular historical period that you'd like to go back to?
I think it'd be a terrible kind of punishment to be made to go back in history, particularly if you're a woman. There is not a single historical period in world history where women had halfway as decent a time as they do now. So deciding to go back there, that would be a self-inflicted punishment. I think I'd rather go in the future. And there's also, even for men, there's considerable disadvantages about the past, like no antibiotics and no aspirin.
Today we live in a celebrity culture, but in Meet the Romans, you focus on the lives of the ordinary people in Rome. Was that a conscious decision to try to get people away from celebrity culture?
I was rather pleased that people did actually find, the non-celebrity version of the Romans interesting. And in some ways, if it was a small antidote to modern celebrity culture, I'm extremely pleased. I think that wasn't quite what was driving me, though, because I think the celebrities of the ancient world are so remote from us in some ways. And one of the things that puts people off ancient history is that, the big narrative books, the history of the big men, never seem to answer all those questions that we know we all want to know about the ancient world, or any period in the past. Where did they go to the loo? And actually, I think people are often shortchanged about in terms of the providing an answer to questions which are really good ones. In the end, most women, don't know about men, most women, do really want to know what having a baby was like before the advent of modern obstetrics. That's a big question. It's not it's not simply because it's intimate and female. It doesn't mean it's a less important question than why Julius Caesar was assassinated. And actually, world history contains a lot more people like me and my family, and women and slaves, and people who, want to do many of the things that we want to do, but they can't clean their teeth because there's no such thing as an ancient toothbrush. Now, how does that feel? And I'm not saying in that, I guess, that those big blokish issues aren't important. The assassination of Julius Caesar, is an event in world history that has formed how we look at every other assassination since. When Kennedy's assassinated, we see that partly in relationship to that formative, defining bit of political assassination in Rome. But it's not the only way that Rome's important.
As a historian, how important do you think it is that historical movies should be accurate?
I'm not sure quite how keen I am on accuracy above everything else. And the most important thing, if I was going to make a historical movie, I'd really want to get people interested. And I think that film and television programme makers can be a bit sort of nerdish about accuracy. I remember a friend of mine once told me that he'd acted as an advisor for some Roman film. And the crew were always ringing up when they were on location, saying things like, "Now, what kind of dog should we have? Should it, if we're going to have a dog in the film, should it be an Alsatian or, a Dachshund or whatever?" And, to start with, he said he'd go to the library and he'd kind of look up and he'd find a breed. And eventually, after question, he'd think, look, these guys are getting the whole of Roman history in the big picture utterly wrong, and yet there they are worrying about the damn dogs.
Can you think of any historical movies that you've really enjoyed?
I absolutely loved Gladiator. Never mind its horribly schmaltzy plot. I thought in all kinds of ways it was just a wonderful, brilliant, and I don't know if it was accurate, but a justifiable recreation of ancient Rome. The beginning scenes of Gladiator, which show, Roman combat, just in a sense punctured the kind of slightly sanitized version of, legionaries standing, with all their shields, facing the enemy, all looking ever so kind of neat and tidy. I mean, it was messy and it was bloody and it was horrible. And it was such a different kind of image of Roman combat that I remember we set it in Cambridge as an exam question. How would students judge that kind of representation of Roman warfare?
It's very interesting that there seem to be more and more historical movies recently, and many have won Oscars. Is that because history has all the best stories?
Yes, there's no such good story as a true story, and that's what history's got going for it. Actually, non-fiction, in a kind of way, is always a better yarn than fiction is. And I think it's, I feel very pleased because, and I think, for one thing, it gets some of the best stories from history into the popular. Into popular attention, popular consciousness. But I think also, it shows that you don't always have to be deadly serious about history. History, like classics, is often treated as something which is good for you, but isn't actually going to be much fun. You'll be improved by knowing about it, but it probably will be a bit tedious in the process. And I think that, showing that history can be larky, it can be funny, it can be surprising, it can be something that you can sit down and have a good 2.5 hours at the cinema enjoying, is really all to the good.